The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 24th chapter. Immediately after the suffering of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. The Gospel of the Lord. Last year, before we knew what a novel coronavirus was, or had thoughts about how we would manage teaching and going to school online, long before we learned about how long we could stay on Zoom before we felt like we could look at another screen again, I was in a Lyft heading back home after teaching a course at LSTC. The driver noticed where she'd picked me up, and after driving a few blocks toward downtown, she asked me the question that often strikes fear in the heart of religious leaders everywhere. So, what do you do for a living? For all of you preparing for rostered ministry, you've likely faced this question before. How do you describe what you do on those days when you really don't want to explain your theological worldview? How do you talk about who you are when you'd really rather read a book on the airplane or in the back of a Lyft? But on this drive home, I just said, well, I teach, and I'm a pastor. My driver immediately exclaimed, well then, you are a woman of faith. Yes, that's true, I said. Okay, preacher, I have a question for you then. And I braced myself because I didn't want to sound like I didn't know what I was talking about. And she asked me, okay, Pastor, so are we in the end times? I'll admit, no one had ever asked me that before. Are we in the end times? And after waiting a minute, the only answer I could come up with is, well, I don't know, but I guess it feels like that a lot of the time, doesn't it? It feels like the end times. And if you're anything like me, I'm only a few days into feeling like I can take a deep breath after holding my breath for days as I frantically refreshed my phone, wondering and waiting to find out what the election results might be. There were rumors of wars. Could this be the beginning of a second civil war in the US? What will happen if Trump wins? What will happen if Trump loses? Will the world turn upside down? What does it mean if this drags on longer? Will people storm state houses or become violent when the count doesn't go their way? When the weather is downright balmy in November and huge forests in our country are burning, are we in the end times? Will we ever leave our homes again without fear that sickness surrounds us? Will we be able to rely on steady work and living wages? Is this what it feels like when you've fallen over the edge of the story and you're in the end and everything is just about to come crashing down? We come to our texts for this day as people that are all too familiar with the sinking feeling that something is wrong around us, knowing what it's like to have stomachs that are tense with anxiety, where the world seems as if it is on fire both literally and figuratively. We come to this service today knowing that it's also Veterans Day, and that just as we may hold military service members in deep regard, the rates of suicide and unaddressed post-traumatic stress are an all too common reality. Are we in the end times? It sure feels like it sometimes, doesn't it? The community receiving the prophecy of Joel, our first reading for today, were familiar with that feeling that things were not right in the world. The book of Joel begins following a plague of locusts that have decimated the land. Joel names not only the mourning of the people who are dismayed when they survey their destroyed lands, but Joel tells us that even the animals groan and the fields mourn the loss of the harvest. But Joel tells the people, God is coming and will return not only to send grain, oil, and wine, but so that even the soil itself and the animals of the field may know that God is with them. God will return to the people the harvest of the land, but will also pour upon them God's Spirit, filling the people with visions and dreams of a future. All of this has happened, leading to our passage from Joel for this day, full of the promise of a restored land where even the soil itself rejoices, and the people are filled with visions and dreams again, and God's voice is not silent. We are reminded that even in a world where God pours out visions, war and rumors of war, pain and anguish are still a reality. Their children have been captured and sold. They've been scattered by their enemies. Their treasures have been stolen. This is not just a plague of locusts, but the harsh reality that the world around them is not secure. Is this perhaps what it feels like for the people of this community to be in the end times? When I first started thinking about this sermon and the word we might all need to hear, I did a quick glance over the reading from Joel and read quickly about swords and plowshares. And I thought to myself, yes, right. Even when things are the hardest, when we are the most scared, we need to be the people who beat swords into plowshares, who wage peace when the world says war. We resist the powers that call us to fight, and we do the good work of turning weapons into implements of earth-keeping. There's a sermon here, and I am ready to preach it. And then, like record scratch, I had to read the text again. This isn't that famous line from the 2nd chapter of Isaiah. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Joel doesn't tell us to become the makers of peace in Isaiah, but rather proclaims to the nations. Joel says, prepare war. Stir up the warriors. Let all the soldiers draw near. Let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weakling say, I am a warrior. Let the weakling say, I am a warrior. Get the plowshares and the pruning hooks and make them into weapons so that you can join alongside God to fight for justice, to bring the people back to their communities, to end the destruction of community. Whether they are fighting against natural disaster or human violence, the people in the book of Joel are called to join God and to fight for liberation. I can't say I know how to feel about this. Perhaps some of you, especially on this Veterans Day, can hold together thoughts about war and justice and can find your way into this passage and understand it. Perhaps you feel a call to be a warrior and it makes sense to you. But I think for many of us, it seems much easier to carry the words of Isaiah instead of these words of Joel. But here is what I do know. Throughout our readings in the book of Matthew today and in this season and further, we are reminded that we are a people of the end times. Not the end times of popular culture where we prepare for the rapture and punishment and beasts, but a people who know that even in a time when God is pouring out God's visions, when God has given the people words to speak and prophecies to proclaim, when we can see that world where God's vision is already accomplished, we live as a people of the not yet, a people who are in the times before the end, where we are called to do the work of God, to fight alongside God for a world where all know justice, to fight alongside God for a world that isn't on fire, to fight for our soil and our waters, to name white supremacy and root it out, to fight against the ways we have been taught to marginalize and ignore others, to fight alongside God for a vision we know is the end of the story, even if it seems so distant to our present now. Maybe a word we all need to hear from Joel is that when we feel weak, when we don't know our place in the movement, when the best we can do is refresh our feed to find out what decisions are being made on our behalf, when we are lost and unsure and afraid, that God says, "My child, you are not a weakling. You are a warrior. You are not the weakest link in the chain. You are an integral part of the work that God is doing in the world right now." So when you feel afraid, when it feels as if it has been a long time since you have heard a word from the Lord, when you can't see a vision or you can't dream a dream, we will fight alongside you for a world that is promised, for a place where justice reigns, where power is held by the powerless, where the mighty are cast down and the poor uplifted. Are we in the end times? I suppose if I could go back to that conversation and answer again, I might say, of course, we are a people who are waiting for the end of the story. But in the meantime, in these times, we are a people who fight alongside God for a future that is not yet here, for a dream that is not yet realized. But even if it doesn't always feel like it fits, even if the image is hard to hold, we are warriors for that future that rests in our God. Amen. And thanks be to God.